into it.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about how to kind of landscape with native plants. A little bit about me. My name is Aaron Stiles. I run Foraging Ahead. It's a landscape design company where we focus specifically on native plants. And one of my rules is I'll do non-natives if the client asks, but I will always talk them out of invasives. I won't plant invasive plants. Background, I worked at the UAH research greenhouse while I was getting my bachelor's degree. I helped with a lot of projects there because I was the manager of the greenhouse. So even if I wasn't like doing the research, I was involved in a lot of it. We did a lot of research on fuzzy kiwis, Georgia asters, native pitcher plants, bog species, all kinds of stuff. And then I worked on some farms and some nurseries, and I've been studying medicinal and native wildflowers ever since I was in high school. And then in January 2023, I said, hey, nobody's doing this. Why don't I do it? So I got started with Foraging Ahead and started doing native landscape design. So you guys, Wild Ones members, you probably know why we want to plant native plants, but I always include this slide anyway because it's helpful to kind of break it down so that we can tell other people about why they're important. The number one thing that gets people is less maintenance. I mean, we know that it's very important for the environment, but most common people, they either do or don't care too much about it, but the low maintenance is a big selling point for native plants. So I'm always pushing low maintenance. You don't ever have to touch them. You put them in the ground and you weed them a couple times a year, and that's it. Less water, that's another big one. You know, I see people all the time running their sprinklers every single day in the summer, and they complain about having a huge water bill. You don't have to do that if you have native plants. Some native plants you have to water if we have a really bad drought, but most of them are going to survive that. And then overall, they're just less hassle. They're better adapted to our environment. They're just going to grow better here. Whether or not you want to believe that the climate is changing for better or worse, it's changing in one way or another. And our native plants are adapting to that change a little better than non-native ones because they've already adapted to what's going on now. So when we reach those gradual changes, they're going to be a little better suited to that. So with that out of the way, we'll talk about habitat design. One of the things I try to do is instead of just doing native gardens, I want the gardens to be useful for everybody. I want them to be something that supports the homeowner, something that's visually appealing for people driving by, and something that is good for our pollinators and wildlife. So I try to design habitats that look like gardens. Whenever you think of a habitat, you're probably thinking of a wildflower meadow where everything that's growing there is growing there naturally. It's all kind of mixed in, and I think it looks really pretty, but a lot of people don't. So I have to kind of take those elements and put them in this layered design. And you'll see I chose this because this was an example of a micro park that I was doing. They're basically like 1 acre or smaller parks that you put in dense city areas. And this was a proof of concept I was pitching to Mid-City. But basically, I'm going to be using this throughout the PowerPoint to kind of show you guys the steps of designing this. So when we're doing a habitat, you've got to think of both biotic and abiotic factors. We'll get to abiotic factors a little bit later, but right now we're going to talk about the biotic factors. That's anything that relates to living things. Mostly it's going to be your plants. It also consists of like insects, leaf mulch, any animals that are running through your garden. All of those are biotic factors. So when we're designing, the only one we have control over is the plants. So obviously native plants, shrubs, things that pollinators like, things that are providing habitat for pollinators and other wildlife. The main focus being native plants, obviously, just because they provide food, shelter, homes, everything that wildlife needs with exceptions of like water. And some plants provide water as well. Right here, I talk a little bit about planting in layers. Again, when you think of a native habitat, you're thinking of like when you look outside and it's just a big open field and there's kind of shrubs randomly. There might be a woodland edge that feeds into an open field with some woods behind it, with big trees and understory trees. We can't really do that in a garden setting. I would love to. It would be really nice, but it's not aesthetic, so people don't want it. So instead, we have to kind of plant in layers and we have to make a backdrop. Most of the time when I'm doing a backdrop for houses, I'll use evergreen plants. I know here in Alabama, in terms of native evergreens, we have like three good options, and that's cultivated Yopon hollies, cultivated inkberry hollies, and wild type Florida anise. And that's pretty much our options for small or rate affordable size shrubs, I guess, because an inkberry can get like 20 feet tall if you're not careful, and nobody wants that next to the house. In this design, I actually didn't use any evergreens. I tried to get winter color in other ways. So I used beauty berries, which have the purple berries in the wintertime. I used the viburnums, also have berries in the wintertime. And they have a very interesting growing habit. So even when their leaves are gone, they still look really nice. The muhly grass is there to add texture. And then the summer sweets, in the wintertime, they're going to be a dead bush. And that's just sometimes you have to kind of be okay with that. But this is providing a backdrop so that if you're setting right here, you want to be able to look out and you don't really want to see what's behind it. Because this whole area here is your garden, this whole area is the micro park, and then everything else is either wild behind it and you're screening that out, or people, they like to have their lawns. I like to replace lawns with native ground covers. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah. So getting into the biotic factors a little bit, that's things like, we're still in biotic factors, I'm sorry. It's been a long day, y'all. um, Once you have your backdrop, you want to start filling in with the perennials. This is where you're going to get most of your color from. As you can see in the 3D model, a lot of the shrubs in the back are going to have white blooms. I do try to do a lot of the white blooming shrubs because we have a lot here and they look really nice, but people like their color and they like a lot of color. So one of the things that we do is we try to make sure we're hitting focal points. So this camera angle is kind of if you were sitting on that bench and looking straight ahead, this is what you're seeing. So we want to make sure what you're seeing here is a nice splash of color in the center, a nice backdrop here, some sort of focal point here, which in this case is the grass. And then from your peripherals, you've got yellow and yellow. And these are two different types of yellow. That's Rudbeckia, that's Tickseed coreopsis. So you're going to have a little bit of height variation, but if you're setting there, the main thing is you want to see yellow here, something else in the middle. That kind of ties in the garden and makes it all kind of come together and look like one full garden rather than a bunch of plants that have just been tossed in there randomly. Abiotic factors. This is the slide I thought we were on a minute ago. These are, I accidentally pressed the button, I'm sorry. These are your non-living things. These are your rocks. This is water. This is your climate, rotting logs, anything like that. It would be an abiotic factor. The soil is an abiotic factor. So when you're looking at this, you kind of want to make sure that the plants are going to do well in your climate and in your soil. Around here, we have a lot of red clay. I had a client the other day which posed a unique challenge. It's the first time I've ever worked on like a limestone glade where if you dig down 2 inches, you're just on limestone. The soil is very alkaline there, and they couldn't get any of the normal native plants to grow. I'm like, hey, luckily, we actually have a habitat management program for that. We have a list of plants that grow in those limestone glades. I think this native privet is one of them. So we're trying to work with them to get them some plants that will grow well there. And then in the front, they've got a natural spring, which again deposits a lot of that limestone. So it's very alkaline. So we're having to use native plants that like wet areas, and like alkaline. And that leaves us with like rush and some grasses that are tolerant of that. So it can definitely be a challenge if you have kind of those weird, unique areas like that. But I think those weird, unique areas can become something really beautiful. We'll talk a little bit about the focal points again. And when we're doing abiotic factors, one of the things I always try to get people to add in their gardens are large rocks or rock piles. And I know that sounds weird because what's the use of a rock in a garden? Well, that's actually providing a lot of habitat for lizards and snakes and spiders and all kinds of little critters that like to hide under the rocks and get up in the crevices. And I know a lot of people jump when I say snakes and spiders, but here's the thing about that, right? If you don't like snakes and you don't like to see snakes, put a snake habitat in your garden because you won't have to see the snakes anymore. Because they're not going to be out in your yard. They're gonna see you coming and they're gonna run to that snake habitat. So that's why I'm like, hey, you don't like snakes? We're going to put a rock pile in this back corner. You'll be able to see the rocks above all of your plants. It's going to make a nice focal point, and the snakes are going to be around that and not around you. I know it's hard to see on this, but this is a water pool that I was putting in here, again, to kind of show how you might use abiotic factors. Water is very important for wildlife, pollinators, birds. Everything needs water to survive. So if you're creating shelter and you're creating food and you're not getting any wildlife in your garden and you're like, what's going on? Why don't I have my birds or my pollinators? It's because you need water because they're not going to get too far from a water source. It's going to be a stress on them. And if you've got a water source in your garden, that's going to attract a lot more wildlife. I'm sure a lot of you were here when, what was his name? Yes, thank you. When Mr. Lewis was doing his presentation and he was showing the videos of all the different things that came by to drink from his water fountain, that was amazing. Again, talking a little bit more about focal points. So you can see right here, we've got a bench for like a picnic table. Back here, we've got this bench. I already talked a little bit about how the focal point's going straight ahead. You're looking at this grass, you're looking at this water pile. If you're setting here, the focal point is when you look towards the garden. And when you look towards the garden and you look straight ahead, you're going to be aimed right at this big rock. So we've got to accent that big rock. And that's why you see these three flowers here. Those are all, I believe, coneflower. I don't think I have them marked here. I do have them marked, but I've got them marked wrong. But yeah, those are purple coneflower. So they'll get fairly big. They have a pretty long bloom time. That's the kind of thing that you want to put around your focal point. And then you want to put some more plants around that bloom at different times of the year. So that way, when the coneflowers finally go down, when they finally become just a stick with a seed head on top, you've still got this yarrow that's looking nice and green and fluffy, and you've got these purple beauty berries starting to put their berries on and starting to look really nice and pretty. So talk a little bit about selecting plants. Again, you guys, Wild Ones members, you probably know a lot about native plants. People call me an expert, but sometimes when I'm talking to you guys, I'm always learning something. I was with Charles the other day, and he was showing me native dayflower. Can you believe I didn't know we had a native dayflower? I thought it was all the invasive kind, but he showed me the difference. And after he pointed it out, I realized that some of the plants that I was pulling up thinking that was the invasive dayflower is not. So we're always learning new things and trying to improve. When you're selecting plants, though, the three things that you mostly want to think about are climate. That's how cold it's going to get in your area. That's how wet the soil is, how much rain it's going to get, how much sun it's going to get. You want to think of size. Again, we talked earlier about like cultivated inkberries versus wild type inkberries. If you're trying to put something under a low window and you want to accent that window, then you're probably going to want a shamrock inkberry, right? It gets about 3 foot tall, really nice, really hardy. If you put a wild type there, it's going to completely block the window and eventually start messing up your gutters, dropping leaves, dropping berries, and become a mess. So that's where like Cultivars are nice to have. I understand that we like wild types, and wild types are definitely better, but sometimes for the sake of aesthetics, you got to go with the dwarf variety. Last one is bloom time. Bloom time is really important and really something that gets overlooked, something that I even overlook a lot. There are times if I'm dealing with a tough area like a garden that's all wet shade, I'm just throwing every plant I can find that tolerates wet shade in there, and then I look at the end of the design and I'm like, they're not going to have anything blooming until midsummer, and then it's going to bloom from midsummer to September, and it's going to look great. But in the spring, they're going to be calling me saying, "What's going on?" So it's something that you kind of want to think about before you start planting. That's where the designs like I was showing you earlier come in handy. I thought I had one on this slide, but I don't. I'm sorry about that. Climate. Obviously, it's important to make sure that your plants are well adapted to our climate. We have really hard summers and really hard winters. So if you're looking at a plant at a nursery, Home Depot, wherever, even if it's a plant that's native here, if it was grown up in Minnesota, coneflowers that were grown in Minnesota that they're the plants they got the seeds from are growing in Minnesota, that they collected them from a farm in Minnesota, they're not going to do well here. They're going to get really burnt out whenever we hit our hot streaks. They're going to like start to fry, their leaves will turn brown, it's going to look rough. So local ecotypes are definitely something that's worth looking into. Sometimes that's hard. And then sometimes it's just a matter of getting those plants in the ground and keeping them watered and keeping them kind of babying them in that first season so that they can adapt to our local climate. Some plants are a little better at that than others. Coneflowers, for example, since I just mentioned them, they'll eventually adapt. It's just for a couple years, they're going to look pretty rough unless you can get them from more local nurseries. Luckily, we have a lot of growers up in Tennessee that are growing native plants. We have Recreative Natives near Birmingham. She grows all of her stuff from seeds, and all of her stuff is going to go really well here. The only thing is, Birmingham's not quite as cold as it is up here, but the plants are going dormant in the winter anyway, so their freezes aren't mild enough to make our freezes a problem. You can also think about microclimates. That's something a lot of people don't really realize is a thing, but if you live up on the mountain, your microclimate is going to be very different than if you live in the valley in a big subdivision where there's not a lot of green material. It's going to be a lot harder, and your freezes are going to be a lot harder. So that's something to think about, is kind of spend some time tracking your own temperatures, like in your yard, not just in Huntsville, but think about how hard the ground is when it freezes. Think about how much sunlight you get. Think about if it says that it's 90 degrees in Huntsville and you step outside and you're like, hey, this feels great. You've probably got a microclimate where you can plant more cold hardy plants. Size, again, we talked about this a little bit, but mature size is definitely very important. Native plants do like to hold hands, as we call it in landscaping. That's basically when you look at a design and you see all of those circles, a lot of landscapers will put a bunch of space in between those circles. They'll do a boxwood hedge, and the boxwoods are planted like 4 feet apart because they want that space in between them so that they can reach their mature size and they can grow and make a nice, pretty hedge. Native plants don't want that. Native plants like to be close together. If you've got a shrub, you don't want to put shrubs like right on top of each other, but you want them to be close enough to the perennials and all the other things that they'll grow together a little bit. That not only helps keep down weeds, that's what our native plants are used to. So the really tall native plants, that's going to provide support for them, and they're not going to flop over as much. Obviously, when you're doing that, make sure you're thinking of your layers. I did a little graphic example over here where I've got a pretty shrub in the front, some flowering grasses. This could be like a blue-eyed grass or something like that in front of the shrub to be a low layer, and then some tall flowers in the back. I like to put tall flowers behind shrubs because a lot of times those tall flowers look really ugly from about halfway down. Think of goldenrod, right? I love goldenrod. It's a beautiful plant until you look down, and then from about 3 feet down, it's just a bare stem. and it looks so bad. So put that behind your inkberries, and it's going to shoot up right through the inkberries. They're not going to hinder it at all, and it's going to look beautiful in the fall. And then you can take the blooms and make tea. Bloom time, again, that's just kind of knowing when the plant's going to bloom. So it's hard to know exactly because microclimates can affect bloom time, but having a general idea of asters are usually going to bloom in the fall. So I want to plant asters along with um, tick seeds and phlox, which will bloom in spring and summer. And I love coreopsis. I put coreopsis all the time because it's such a long blooming plant. It'll bloom all the way from like late spring to early fall sometimes. It's great. But one of the things is you want your garden to have color all year. The main thing is you want pollinators to have food all year. If you have a gap between spring and fall where you didn't plant any of your coneflowers or rudbeckia or any of your summer blooming perennials, then your pollinators are starving during that time and they've got to go somewhere else. You don't want them to go somewhere else. You want them to stay here because I like to see those pollinators. I want to get photos of all of the cool little wasp and butterflies so I can put on Instagram and say that I'm better than everyone else, right? I actually replaced this image this morning because I realized the one that I had found was from Oregon. And I spent a solid 45 minutes digging for one that was a little closer. I think this one is Vermont, but it shows a lot of plants that are native here. I think there's only one plant on here that I hadn't heard of, and it was one of these wild senna. Right. I hadn't heard of that one until today. I looked it up. We are at the very bottom of its range map, and it's really rare to find here. Pretty common up north, up in like New England, but it's a really pretty plant, really small, great for borders. But this is a great chart to have to kind of show you not only what color something's going to bloom and what size something's going to be, but when something is going to bloom. The chart does end at September, and I think that's a choice because a lot of these plants will bloom all the way into November. So like New York aster, that's going to keep blooming until like the second or third frost finally kills it. And it's a wonderful plant. So looking at that, thinking about that, it's really nice. Sometimes it can be hard to get plants to start before June, before the last frost, and this list doesn't put any of our spring ephemerals. So things like uh, trout lilies are really good, trilliums are really good, spring beauties are really good. All of those are really early blooming. Some of them bloom even before dandelions do. I know a lot of people are like, oh, keep the dandelions because they help bees before our plants bloom. That's not the case. Get rid of your dandelions, eat them. They taste great. Eat your dandelions. Don't leave them and let them propagate.
Hey, Aaron, I'll
Yes.
make a comment. The Xerxes Society, if you guys are not familiar with it, they have some really great plant lists. I need to put them on the website. But they've got some that are specific to the Southeast. It's not as specific as Alabama, but they have several lists that are pretty similar to this where it tells you what plants are blooming when, and also they tell you about keystone perennial, like flowering plants.
Right.
Herbaceous plants.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely have to look into them. Thank you for that.
I think this says info source Xerxes, so that's one of the sources that they use.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on Google trying to find something that had plants for the Southeast, and this was the best one I could find. So I mean, I guess that's credit to Xerxes Society, where if they made this is one of the best ones I saw. Last problem, I think this is the last thing we're going to talk about. I looked over this morning, but like I said, it's been a long day and I'm a little frazzled. But what are you planting for is an important question because some people want to plant for pollinators, some people want to plant for birds, some people just want to plant for wildlife in general. And I love reptiles, so I like to plant for reptiles. Planting for birds is one of the harder ones to do, actually, because you have to think about a lot more. Mr. Lewis did a great presentation on that, and he gave us a lot of information on how to plant for birds. So the key takeaways from that, if anybody here missed it, basically you want to make sure you've got vertical pathways because birds like to feel safe when they're going from the treetops to the ground, and they do have to go both. A lot of people are like, oh, birds, they stay in the treetops all day. They come to the ground, and that's where they get a large portion of their food, and that's where they'll one of the things that he was showing that was really cool to me is if you have a nice mulch bed and it heats up in the wintertime, the birds will come to the ground and they'll fan out and they'll warm up on that mulch bed. So having vertical pathways will help the birds feel safer when they're going from top to bottom. It'll also help them feel safer when they're going from one area to the next because they can use those pathways to limit the amount of time they're like out in the open. Another big one is food. Birds eat a lot of nuts, a lot of berries, but the main thing birds eat is insects. 90% of every bird's diet, even hummingbirds, are insects. So you really want to plant those flowering plants that's going to bring in the insects and help the birds. In terms of wintertime, you want plants that have seed heads like mints, coneflowers, plants that have berries that hold on for a long time, like your beauty berries and your viburnums. Those are all things that are going to last for a long time in the winter and feed those birds in the wintertime while the insects are asleep. Water, again, I mentioned water earlier. Water is really important for everything, especially birds. Birds like nice, clear water sources, and they almost exclusively drink from running water. So if you've got a bird bath, sometimes they'll drink from that because it's a nice shallow dish, and they do like to drink from little puddles because they know that's like rainwater is a lot cleaner. So that and fountains. The one that Mr. Lewis was showing that all the wildlife was visiting was a rock with a bubbler in it. It was really pretty. They're not hard to make, but they can be a pain if you don't know what you're doing, like I don't. But they are so nice. And if you've got a nice little reservoir at the bottom, you don't have mosquitoes because mosquitoes don't nest in moving water, and you're going to attract a lot of birds, a lot of wildlife, a lot of pollinators, and a lot of other good aquatic insects like dragonflies. Butterflies, probably one of the easiest things to plant for because it's just knowing what their host plant is. If you plant their host plant, they're going to come. If you plant Asclepias tuberosa, you're probably going to wind up with some monarchs. That one's a little bit weird here because monarchs migrate through here. This isn't where they like stay for a long period of time. So we don't actually, to my knowledge, I've not seen a lot of monarch caterpillars in general, but most of the time when we plant that milkweed, we wind up with one or two in a couple of years. Grasses are really important for a lot of butterflies. A lot of people want to skip grasses when they're doing pollinator gardens. I always say don't skip the grasses. Make sure you're planting some native grasses, switchgrass, muley grass. Big blue stem is an amazing addition to any garden. And that serves multiple purposes. For one, a lot of butterflies use those as host plants. And our native grasses, when they send up their bloom stalks, those stalks are hollow. And in the wintertime, those stalks are still there. And that's where a lot of our native bees are nesting in the winter.
Hey, Aaron, I've got a question about that.
Yes.
Are sedges a good substitute for grasses, or are they not really?
Sedges are great. I would say they're not really a good substitute unless you can't grow grasses. Like if you're in an area that's full shade, you're not going to be able to grow our native grasses. So sedges are good, but they're not going to have the same hollow stems that are big enough for like the pollinators to nest in. They are still really good for like ground nesting bees because ground nesting bees love to get underneath biomass, and sedges and grasses both have a lot of biomass that persists throughout the winter. Great question. Thank you. Reptiles. I love reptiles. I'm a big reptile fan. Planting for reptiles is they do like sedges. They do like grasses. They do like a lot of shelter, but they don't necessarily like a lot of really tall plants because most of them aren't going to be very climby. Most of them are going to love your 1 to 2 foot small bushy plants and rock piles. They love rock piles because if you've got a bunch of small rocks and you just drop them into place, there's going to be so many little nooks and crannies that you can't see and you can't get into, and they're going to find their way into it. and they're going to love it. And then, hey, if you don't like snakes, you don't have to see the snakes because they're in between these little rocks. They're going to get right here, and that's where their sun is. And they're great, and they're so easy to do. Because rocks, you don't have to cut them back in every now and then. You don't have to like prune them. You don't have to deadhead them. They're just there. They're evergreen. They stay there. But in all reality, they also hold a lot of moisture in the soil, and that creates a really good habitat for salamanders and frogs. That's why I often recommend if you have like rotting logs, put them in your garden, put plants around them, because that's also holding in a lot of moisture. And our salamanders, our amphibians, are dying out rapidly, and they need those areas. So you mentioned keystone species earlier. This is my slide on keystones. It basically shows like the definition, but I do have to go on a little bit of, not really a rant, but kind of give my 2 cents on keystone species, right? Don't get me wrong, I love keystone species. I love all native species. They're great. The problem I have with the way keystones are represented in horticulture is that a lot of people say, plant these plants, plant these keystone plants. They're the most important plants we have. And that's true to an extent. But if everybody's planting oak trees in their yard, then where did the black tupelos go? Who's planting those? So I understand the message of planting keystone species to support more pollinators, but there are pollinators that only host on river oats grass. I'm trying to remember this off memory. It's the Mitchell Sater butterfly. It hosts on river oats and native sedges, and neither of those are considered keystone species. People will say, no, plant big blue stem grass. Big blue stem grass, definitely a keystone species because it creates habitat for quail, creates habitat for reptiles and pollinators and all kinds of things. It's incredibly important. Does not create a habitat for the Mitchell Sater's butterfly, which is the only endangered butterfly in Alabama. So that's why I'm like, keystones are great. If you are just getting into native plant gardening and you're looking for something you're trying to figure out where to start, this is a great starting point. But try to move away from them at some point and try to start putting plants that are maybe a little more rare. Maybe plant our native privet that only grows in a very small area in the southeast and isn't very common. I mean, the only one I've ever seen is in his yard. So this is a great plant to be propagating. And I know I kind of sped through it, but that's my talk. If you have any other questions, you can ask now or you can email me or call me. This is my website. I do a blog post where I talk about gardening for different things and different aspects of gardening. I am not very consistent with my blog post. I'm sorry about that, but I'm trying. It went from once a month to once every couple months to I think I did one this year. So we'll see how that goes. Hopefully in the winter, I'll start posting more. But yeah, if you have any questions, yes, sir.
Yeah, so one thing you didn't talk about is texture. Can you just kind of talk a little bit about what your philosophy is about having good texture in the garden and how you would approach that from a design perspective?
Right, that is a great thing to bring up. I mentioned grasses earlier on an older slide, and that's one of the ways I try to make interest in the winter is by adding those textures with grasses, with things like oak leaf hydrangeas where their bark peels off in the wintertime. That's definitely something that is really useful, especially when you get into more up close gardens and like larger plants. When you're doing perennials, one of the approaches I take is trying not to put too much of the same texture in one spot. So I had a design I was doing, and again, wet shade, I was having some trouble. I had foam flower, heuchera, and tall thimbleweed. And if you guys are familiar with that plant, when I was looking at them all lined up side by side, I could tell the difference, but nobody working with me could. And I couldn't fault them for that because I actually did confuse one of the foam flowers for one of the heucheras and put it in the wrong spot and had to move it. So that's where, like, yeah, texture is definitely important. You can kind of go as detailed or as non-detailed as you want with that. The main thing I would say is try not to put a lot of the same texture in the same spot. If you're doing a rain garden, grasses are really important. Put one grass over here and one grass over here and some perennials in between them. And don't put something like iris in between them because it's just going to look like another grass. And that was a great question. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So you said that, if you have moving water, you won't have mosquitoes, but you'll have dragonflies. Don't dragonfly larvae depend on eating mosquito larvae to survive? Isn't that how that works?
So they eat a lot of things. They'll eat pretty much any larva. They do like to eat mosquito larvae, but if you have any other aquatic insects in there, like crane fly larvae, stonefly larvae, if your water's clean enough, they will feed on those. They'll also feed on a little bit of algae, but they're mostly predatory. Also, I said you're not going to have mosquitoes. You might have a few because there are going to be stagnant pockets, but for the most part, the mosquitoes are going to stay away from moving water. Great question. Thank you. You had a question?
I had a comment, I forgot it.
I'm sorry.
It was along terms of, I guess, dragonfly larvae though they need a bigger area of water.
They-
You need a big kind of space of water, of running water for dragonfly larvae.
They do like larger areas. The adults will hang out around smaller ponds a lot because they're still going to eat a lot of the insects that are like swimming around on top of the water, like your water skeeters and your little water beetles and things like that. But yeah, you might get a few. If you've got a small pond, then you might get a few dragonfly larvae. They may or may not survive, but some of them will even eat tadpoles. So there's kind of like, you might get a few dragonflies. You're probably not going to get a lot of mosquitoes. You'll probably see more dragonflies than you'll have dragonfly larvae.
I wanted to mention, I think that if you're using the city water,
Mhm.
that might.
That'll definitely
Yeah.
impact what's going on. Fun fact about when I first moved to Huntsville, everybody told me don't drink the water. And I thought they were joking, so I looked it up. I did notice that the water tasted a little funny because I'm a big water drinker, right? So I looked it up and it said on their website, I've not looked this up in a while, so they might have changed it. I hope they changed it. But it said the amount of lead in Huntsville tap is undetectable by normal measures. And I was like, that's concerning. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I made a dragonfly pond just
Right.
to attract dragonflies.
Oh, that's really
And
cool.
the problem I had with it is it attracted frogs. They
Mhm.
got really loud.
Yeah, frogs will love your pond.
They were loud.
Yeah. Frogs will love your pond because you don't have the main predators that tadpoles are worried about, which are fish. Fish and birds, and rarely dragonfly larvae will get big enough to eat a tadpole, but it does happen. And frogs are they seek out temporary ponds for their spawn. And if you've got a small basin of water, they're going to love that, and you're going to have frogs all year, and it's going to get really loud.
My problem is I made it too close to the house.
Right. Right. Somebody else had a question? Yes.
First of all, I liked your bloom calendar. I think that's really useful, and it's something that I kind of look at from time to time and aspire to get there. So I have something blooming all year. But I was going to ask you about companion plants. Do you know good resources for like figuring out what goes with what? You kind of talked about how some plants kind of support each other structurally, and where can we look to find like what should we be planting together so that we have those supporting structures, but also maybe like for beauty and for for pollinators and other things.
I wish I had a good source to give you.
Okay.
My background is in plant physiology, so that helps a lot because I can kind of look at a plant and see how it's growing and say, oh, these two plants are growing the same way. These two plants are using different nutrient sources. this plant grows really tall and likes a lot of sun. This plant grows really short and likes a little bit of shade from the in the afternoon, so they'll go together. A lot of it is kind of, unfortunately, just trying to figure it out, and that can be really challenging. Even if you've got a background in plant physiology or horticulture and you know a lot about native plants, it's definitely hard to find those companion plants. So what I look for is I try to look for plants that are going to visually go well together, and then I try to kind of dig a little bit deeper if I need to and see if they're plants that will grow well together. An example of that is purple prairie clover is a really pretty plant, and they have it down at Recreative Native, so I've been trying to use it a lot more in designs, but it doesn't handle competition very well, which is part of the reason it's on decline. So whenever I'm planting it, a lot of times I'll plant it in the center of rock piles because I also love using bee balm. I cannot plant prairie clover next to bee balm. It will die. The bee balm will choke it out. What I can put next to bee balm are native sedges because they create a dense biomass and they'll create a hedge around it and slow the spread of that bee balm, make it a little bit harder to break out because it spreads by rhizomes. So that's kind of what I look for when I'm doing companion planting is I try to see how does the plant grow, how does the plant spread, are they going to be competing for sunlight or nutrients? Great question.
I've got a question.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned 3 evergreens that you use, it's inkberry and yopon, and I didn't catch the name of the third one.
It's Florida anise. There's also
Yeah, okay. I know.
there are also wax myrtles, which are technically evergreen, but a lot of times they die up here. I've heard that they have a lot better success down in like central to South Alabama. I think if you lived in a subdivision where you've got a hotter microclimate, you would probably be okay. But if you're like up on the mountain, they're not going to grow well. You've also got mountain laurel and rhododendrons. I've not had a lot of luck planting those in a garden setting. Sometimes if you're a really good gardener, then you can definitely grow those and they can be beautiful, but they like to be babied and they like to have a lot of moisture. Well, I say that. They don't like to be babied, but you have to baby them. So it's kind of a balance. Yes.
We're talking about the dwarf inkberry
Mhm.
I'm not familiar, is that at Recreative Native? So do you have a place in Tennessee that you recommend sourcing?
I get most of my plants either from Recreative Natives or locally. Recreative doesn't carry a lot of cultivars. I think the only one she has right now are Fizzy Mizzy Itea, which is a great cultivar, by the way. It's a dwarf Itea and it's beautiful. And I think she has a cultivar of Clethra and a cultivar of Turtlehead, but she doesn't have cultivars of the inkberries.
I got inkberry from her back in March, and I
Mhm.
found from breeds much. Apparently, it's really, really hard to find male ones.
Yes,
Cultivars.
yes.
And so they come in distinct male and female. So I got 3.
Mhm.
One died, but I have 1 of each. So I'm like,
Yep.
yes.
Yeah, male cultivars, it is hard to find. Same with Yopon hollies, it's hard to find males because landscapers don't want them to bloom and produce berries because they think that's messy. And I think that's crazy of them to think that because you're missing out on an entire aspect of what makes the plant beautiful. In terms of growers, most of the people that I know to get inkberries from sell them in the fall. I usually get them from Bennett's Nurseries down on South Parkway, but he's out. And last time I talked to him, he didn't know if they were going to get any more until next spring because he checked all of the grower list and they just aren't growing them right now.
Bennett or Earth Touch?
I've not found them at Earth Touch. I have
You
found
just
them at
said South
Bennett's.
Parkway, and Bennett, North Parkway?
North Parkway. I'm sorry. I got confused.
Just checking.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Would you repeat the names of those evergreens that you'll find?
Yes, Yopon, Inkberry, and Florida anise. I've heard some people call it anise. I don't know what's correct. I've always called it anise. And then, like I said, there's also rhododendrons and mountain laurels, but they're a little bit harder to grow.
I haven't heard you speak to the mammals that I invade my yard.
Right. That is a good point. So mammals, They're going to like a lot of the same things that you're already putting in here. You know, squirrels and any kind of climbing mammal is going to love the same habitats as birds. Field mice, voles, moles, they're going to be okay with your nice dense flower plantings. Raccoons and foxes and possums, they like to have shelter. So if you've got rock piles, then sometimes they'll dig under those. They like to get under decks and like to get under, if you've got like a raised shed, they'll get under that. In terms of planting specifically for them, bringing in insects is going to be what brings them in. And then having that water source is going to get you a lot of mammal traffic. And yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the bubbler rocks,
Yes, ma'am.
and the things I've seen with those, it looks like there's just it's not really a pond
Mhm.
that's with it, it's just a wet area.
Right.
Will that still be moving?
That will still be moving. The way those usually work is sometimes people feed in a drip system to it, or like not a drip system, but an irrigation system that's constantly running and constantly soaking the ground around them. Most of the time, they have a basin that's buried underground beneath it so that you don't have a pond, but it's still collecting the water and feeding back into the system. That's going to make it to where you're not having any of like the aquatic insects or anything like that, but it's still a water source for birds, mammals, and insects in general.
And the sound attracts the birds.
Yes, the sound does attract the birds. Yes, ma'am.
I have a above ground fountain,
Mhm.
and I got it this year, and I'm wondering, I would like it to have it through the winter.
Mhm.
Do you know of, and I'm gonna reach out to across the pond, and I know that they're a good fountain resource, but do you know of like heaters, or what's year-round solution for an above ground fountain?
So one of them is just kind of keeping a watch on the weather and making sure to turn it off at night before a hard freeze. Because here in Alabama, we don't ever get cold enough during the day to keep moving water frozen. So if you have well, that you're right, that's not true. Sometimes it's rare. It's rare. It does happen. It's rare. But for the most part, if it's moving, it's going to be a lot harder to freeze. You can get like a heater that you put into the basin. Across the pond would know a lot more about this than I do. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming and for listening.